Okay, so here's a game that I've wanted to get my hands on for a good long while, and I'm glad I did. Castlevania Chronicles, a PlayStation conversion of a 1993 remake of the original NES Castlevania developed for the Sharp X68000 computer. If you don't know what an X68000 computer is, don't worry, the thing was only available in Japan, so you wouldn't have known. As such, the game wasn't officially available to the masses until Konami decided to port it over in 2001, allowing gamers who didn't resort to emulation to play this game for the first time. Now, I actually did get to play the original X68K version through emulation, but emulation back in those days, and especially with the hardware I had back then, was pretty shite, so it was nice to have a copy of the game that I could play as it was meant to be played. Well, sort of. As Castlevania Chronicles is a remake of the original 1987 Castlevania, the story remains more or less the same. You play the vampire hunter Simon Belmont, and you're charged with the task of traversing the demon castle and vanquishing the forces of the evil Count Dracula. There's little in terms of plot progression here, between levels you walk across a map of the castle displaying your progress, but back in the day a little story is all we ever really needed. Castlevania Chronicles offers two modes of play, Original and Arrange. Original mode is essentially the original X68000 version as it was originally played and presented without any of the changes, tweaks, and additions made to the game. Arrange mode is the brand spanking new version, well, back in 2001 at least, where you have the couple new sprites, illuminating candles, techno soundtrack, and other minor changes to the gameplay. While there are very little differences between the two, they actually distinguish the two apart in various ways. Of course, purists can play the original mode, while those wanting to play the game and not get killed early on can pick the Arrange mode. More on that later. Irregardless of which mode you play, however, the general premise remains the same. You venture through 8 stages using your whip and your various sub-weapons to fight off the various enemies in the game, all the while navigating your way past the various traps and obstacles throughout the level. And of course, you have your share of hidden items scattered throughout these levels, offering either some major bonus points or a little healing power. In other words, this is pretty much your traditional old-school Castlevania romp, and is a formula that works fairly well even to this day. Although a remake of the original game from 1987, Castlevania Chronicles does institute some minor improvements in the gameplay, such as the ability to control your jump in midair, as well as the ability to whip downwards. There is also a rare herb sub-weapon that could restore health at a cost of 10 hearts per use. While these changes and tweaks aren't as dramatic as those found in Super Castlevania 4 for the Super Nintendo, they're different enough to be considered a step up from Castlevania 1, and it makes for interesting gameplay at least. I mean, really, any little addition is a big help towards managing the difficulty in Castlevania Chronicles. And let's not miss any words here. Anyone who has played the original X68K version will tell you that this game is hard as nails. A grossly difficult affair that is suited for the Castlevania hardcores, and original mode maintains this high threshold of pain as expected. Not only that, but original mode also maintains the constantly increasing difficulty each time you defeat the game. It's not like the original Castlevania where you beat the game once and it only gets harder the second run and that's what you get for the rest of the game, no matter in subsequent loops. No matter how many times you beat the game, it's always going to be as difficult as the second loop. Here, you could be going through the game on the 5th or 6th loop and the game will still find new ways to piss you off. It's really intriguing stuff for those with the fortitude to push onwards. The Arrange mode, on the other hand, is a little more forgiving, as you can select your level of difficulty at the options screen. And even on the hard mode, the game never gets to frustrating levels of difficulty, at least nowhere near as difficult as original mode. It's still pretty manageable. Still, the levels themselves tend to be a bit tricky yet ingenious in design. Take note of the tall statue dripping blood skeletons or the giant axe of doom when you get to them. And some of the bosses and enemies in this game aren't exactly pushovers either. They'll give you a good fight and a good challenge, irregardless of what mode you play. In terms of visuals, Castlevania Chronicles looks fairly decent for something that was released in 1993, and everything looks like what they're supposed to. You recognize all the characters on all the enemies and all the elements. One thing I did notice was that some of the larger elements in the game, such as the spinning gears, the certain platforms, and a couple other items, tend to look a bit rough, distorted, and heavily pixelated. While I'm aware this is an issue with the original game, it's almost perplexing as to why these haven't been fixed in this re-released. Maybe smoothed out so it looks a bit nicer. You know, it is a PlayStation after all. It's a lot more powerful than what the older computer systems were of the time in 1993. Other than that, the game looks fine. Visually, it's a couple steps above what you get on the Sega Genesis, but below Super Nintendo standards. I mean, that's the best comparison I could give it, but it looks alright regardless. Playing the Arranged mode of the game replaces the pre-existing Simon and Dracula sprites with new ones, and they seem to fit in rather nicely with the rest of the game. even if Simon does look a bit effeminate, which is an issue I had even with some of the characters in the Symphony of the Night game. It's the same artist, apparently, who did them. There's also illuminated candles and some smoother flame effects for certain monster deaths, and a couple other minor tweaks and changes that don't really do much to enhance the game. You're still playing an old computer game from 1993, but are still a nice little touch regardless. Castlevania Chronicles' high point is in its music. The music from the original X68K version has been retained along with the other two variants, which can be accessed via a code, and is a decent compilation of familiar tunes from past games along with a few new ones. For the most part, it's a fairly decent batch of tunes. When playing the arranged game, you'll be bombarded with the new remixed soundtrack created for the PlayStation version. I have mixed feelings about the remix, but generally it's okay, and if you don't like it, you could use a code to pick out one of the 3 older soundtracks to play as you're playing the game. Sound effects are a step above the Genesis, but below what you get on a Super Nintendo. Again, the best comparison. It's the best, it's middle of the road. On arrange mode, some sounds are slightly enhanced and a little better sounding, but not notably different than when you would play in original mode. Castlevania Chronicles overall is a fairly solid and fun entry in the series, and it's awfully nice of Konami to bring this game over to the States, way back when. There was some initial disappointment from some people over this game, either because it was a step down from 1997's Symphony of the Night, or that it wasn't anything special, or that it wasn't Dracula X Rondo of Blood, another notable Castlevania game that was only available overseas for the longest time until recently. I could sort of understand that point, but at the same time, Castlevania Chronicles was at least a sign that Konami was going to bring some of the lost classics over, and it's still a nice throwback to the good old days, best enjoyed by anyone who is a fan of the old school Castlevania games. The PlayStation 1 disc is a fairly pricey affair, but it is available on the PlayStation Network if you have a PSP or a PlayStation 3, so if you're willing to blow the cash, it's definitely worth picking up.